Hi everybody! This video goes over narrative point of view. The terms I'm going to be talking about in this video are narrator, narrative point of view, and related to that, third person point of view, first person point of view, third person limited point of view, and third person omniscient point of view, and then also free and direct discourse. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the term narrator. The term narrator refers to the person who is telling a story or a novel. Sometimes the narrator is a character within the story or the novel, and sometimes the narrator is a person who's outside of the story or the novel. It's important to keep in mind, however, that the narrator is not the same as the author. So even when a narrator has access to characters' internal thoughts or feelings, we shouldn't assume that the narrator is voicing the author's thoughts or feelings. So whenever we're talking about the voice of the person who is telling the story, we should use the term narrator and not the term author or the author's name. Narrative point of view, which is also often called narrative perspective, refers to the point of view that the narrative is told from. Narrative point of view is determined by who the narrator is, and then also what kind of information the narrator has access to. And I'm going to go over each, at least the most common points of view, in the following slides. The first point of view I'll talk about is first person point of view. A story or novel told from the first person point of view is told by a character who is inside the story or the novel. So this is a character who's interacting with other characters within the story or the novel. In this kind of narrative, the narrator doesn't know anything beyond what he or she has witnessed. So this is the most restricted point of view. And an example of this is the story Cathedral, which we're reading for this week. And this story is told from the perspective of an unnamed character who is within the story. And he can only describe events that he has seen or experienced. And that limits the information that he provides to us as readers. So we never know what his wife is thinking, and we never know what Robert, another character he interacts with, is thinking. The next point of view I'll talk about is third-person limited point of view. A story or a novel that's told from a third-person limited point of view is told by a narrator who is outside the story, so it's somebody who is not a character, and who only has access to a few characters' thoughts. And this is why we use the term limited, because the narrator is limited to either one or maybe two people's perspectives. And an example of this is the story Summer, which we read for last week. And this is told from a third-person limited point of view. The narrator is not a character within the story, so it's not someone who's interacting with Homer or Sandra or the other characters. And the narrator only really reveals what one person, Homer, is thinking or feeling. So the narrator's perspective is limited to the character of Homer, so we call it a third-person limited point of view. And then the last perspective I'll talk about is a third-person omniscient point of view. A story or a novel told from a third-person omniscient point of view is told by a narrator who is outside the story, and who has access to all of the characters' thoughts. And an example of this that you may have read in high school is The Scarlet Letter. This is a novel in which the narrator is not a character within the novel, so not a person who's interacting with other characters, and the narrator reveals what multiple characters, including Hester Prynne, Arthur Dimmesdale, and other characters, what they are thinking and feeling at different times. So rather than being limited to one or two people, this point of view is fairly sort of expansive and reveals information beyond just what one or two characters are thinking. And then the final term I'm going to talk about is free and direct discourse. And this is a term that may be more unfamiliar to you than the other terms I've gone over. Free and direct discourse is a special kind of third-person narration in which a narrator seamlessly slips into the mind of a character, giving the reader access to the character's thought process. And an example I'm going to go over is from one of the stories we read for last week, which is the story of An Hour. And in the passage I'm going to talk about, one of the characters, Mrs. Mallard, is reflecting on sort of her husband, right? She has got this information that her husband is dead, and she's thinking about what her reaction is going to be when she sees his dead body. And I have taken a passage that was in Free Direct Discourse and edited it so that it looks sort of like a standard first-person omniscient point of view in order to illustrate the difference. And I'm going to go over that edited standard third-person omniscient point of view first. So if this passage was edited to be standard omniscient third-person point of view, it would look something like this. She thought to herself, "I will weep again when I see his kind, tender hands folded in death, his face that has never looked save with love upon my face, fixed and gray and dead." So in this version of the passage, we have a clear sort of distinction between the narrator's voice. The narrator says she thought to herself, and then Mrs. Mallard's voice. So Mrs. Mallard is thinking to herself, in quotation marks, "I will weep again when I see his kind, tender hands folded in death," etc. Now, in the actual passage, which is Free and Direct Discourse, we don't have that clear delineation between the narrator's voice and Mrs. Mallard's voice. It begins with the narrator's voice. So it begins by saying she knew she would weep again. But then as the narrator keeps going, it becomes more and more Mrs. Mallard's perspective. So as we keep going, it says, she knew she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her face, fixed and gray and dead. So it's reflecting her feelings, it's reflecting her thoughts, it's probably reflecting even her words. But there isn't that clear delineation between what the narrator is saying and what Mrs. Mallard is thinking. So rather than it being a sort of clear, this person thought, quotation mark, and then the passage, and then the end of quotation mark, the narrator's perspective sort of bleeds into the character's perspective, and it becomes a sort of seamless transition. All right, that is it for this video, which is on narrative perspective. If you have any questions about these terms, let me know, either through email or the Ask My Instructor tool in Blackboard. And otherwise, I look forward to touching base with you in discussion this week.